The deed, worn soft at the creases and smelling faintly of old paper and cedar, felt heavy in James Carter's calloused hand. It was more than a legal document. It was a birth certificate for his heritage. His great-grandfather, a man born into chains but died a landowner, had purchased these 40 acres with the back-breaking proceeds of sharecropping and a dream of self-determination. For James, every stream that babbled through the back acreage whispered his family stories. Every oak in the small forest had borne witness to generations of Carters, their picnics, their heartaches, their quiet triumphs. The land wasn't an asset. It was a member of the family. And then, the invaders came. It started with a low rumble that fell out of place. Then, the trucks, flatbeds carrying bulldozers with dinosaur jaws, and pickups spilling out men in hard hats and steel-toed boots. James watched from his porch, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He saw surveyors with their tripods planting flags like conquest banners on his soil, their bright orange plastic a violent slash against the green of his fields. His heart hammered against his ribs as he strode across the land, the familiar earth feeling suddenly alien under his feet. He approached a foreman who was unfurling a large blueprint across the hood of a truck. "Excuse me," James said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "What are y'all doing on my property?" The foreman, a man with a sun-reddened neck and a weary expression, didn't even look up. "Prepping for foundations. Got a tight schedule to keep." "Foundations for what?" "This is my land. You need to leave. Now." Finally, the man glanced at him, his eyes registering not confrontation, but a minor inconvenience. He shrugged, a gesture of such profound indifference it stole James's breath. "This parcel belongs to the Sweetbriar Meadows HOA now. They're building a new phase. 35 single-family homes. Now, if you'll excuse me." The words landed like physical blows. HOA? Parcel? The legacy of his great-grandfather reduced to developer jargon. James stood rooted to the spot as the machinery roared to life around him, the growl of diesel engines drowning out the songs of the sparrows his mother had loved. He fought back with the only weapons he had, phone calls and paperwork. He called lawyers, who listened politely but used phrases like adverse possession and title dispute that felt like a foreign language of theft. He went to the county clerk's office, where a sympathetic but helpless employee pulled a file. There, nestled amidst modern digital printouts, was a single, faded document from 1952, a tax lien sale for a pittance, a debt his grandfather had sworn was paid in cash, a receipt long since lost to time. It was a common, cruel tactic used to strip black families of their land when they lacked the resources to navigate a rigged system. Weeks bled into months. Every day, James awoke to the sound of progress that was his erasure. The ancient oaks, under which he'd proposed to his late wife, were chainsawed into mulch. The streams were diverted into sterile concrete culverts. The dam, which had supplied water to the area for decades, was now the community lake, a centerpiece for a brochure he'd found crumpled in his mailbox. He became a ghost haunting the edges of his own life, watching from behind a newly erected fence as 35 perfect, identical houses sprouted from the soil that had nurtured his family. Each driven nail felt like a pin in his heart. Each new family that toured a model home, oblivious to the history buried beneath their foundation, was a fresh wave of anguish. James Carter still walked the perimeter every evening, his shadow long in the setting sun. He owned a deed, but the HOA owned the land. He held a legacy in his hands, but they held the keys to 35 front doors. He was a king in a castle that had been dismantled around him, brick by stolen brick, leaving him alone in a single room, surrounded by the echoing silence of what was and the roaring construction of what had been taken. The land was still there, but his world was gone. The local homeowners association, an entity of manicured lawns and suffocating bylaws known as the Sweetbriar Meadows HOA, operated with the smug certainty of those who believe paperwork trumps principle. They had seen an opportunity in the quiet, wooded parcel that bordered their sprawling development, a prime location for their lucrative next phase. To them, James Carter was not a man, he was an obstacle. and they believed they had the perfect tool for removing obstacles, legal loopholes. They claimed the land had been abandoned, a term that tasted like ash in James's mouth. Abandoned? The land where he'd taught his son to fish in the stream? Where he'd buried his favorite hound dog beneath the old magnolia? They produced a convoluted trail of documents, a history of predatory tactics dating back decades. They pointed to a long-discharged tax lien, a bureaucratic error from a time when his grandfather's word and a handshake were worth more than a notary's stamp. They had weaponized his family's humility, their focus on working the land over navigating the labyrinthine county bureaucracy. Clutching his own meticulously kept records, every tax receipt, every payment stub, the original deed with its elegant, fading script, James marched into a HOA board meeting. He was met not with curiosity or concern, but with a wall of condescending smiles and tailored suits. He laid his proof on the polished conference table, the worn papers a stark contrast to the glossy development plans. He spoke of his great-grandfather, of legacy, of justice. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the board president, a man named Thompson with a watch that cost more than James's truck, let out a short, dismissive laugh. It was echoed by a few others around the table. "Mr. Carter," Thompson said, not unkindly, but with the tone one uses on a slow child, "we appreciate your story, but the matter is settled. The title is clear." Another member, a woman with a sharp, impatient face, leaned forward. "Look, you're just one man. We have lawyers, we have money, and now we have 35 families who have invested their life savings in these homes. There's nothing you can do. Be reasonable. We can discuss a goodwill gesture for your inconvenience." The word inconvenience hung in the air, monstrous and insulting. They weren't thieves in the dead of night. They were thieves in broad daylight, with permits and lawyers, and the unshakable belief that their version of reality was the correct one. They saw his quiet dignity as weakness, his humility as a lack of resolve. They assumed he would eventually take a small check and fade away, a sad footnote in the history of their beautiful community. What they failed to see, as they triumphantly plotted sewer lines and street names, was the source of the very water that fed their new community. They built their model homes and paved their curbs, but they overlooked the one crucial detail that couldn't be bought, seized, or argued in court: the dam. That dam, built by his grandfather and maintained by James's own hands, sat upstream, a silent, earthen sentinel. It gave James complete control over the water flow to the entire Sweetbriar Meadows development. The HOA owned the land the water passed through, but they did not own the water itself, nor the hand that guided it. And water, as everyone knows, is the most patient and relentless force on earth. It remembers its path. It carves canyons through stone. It does not forgive arrogance. As James walked away from that meeting, the weight of their laughter still burning in his ears, his eyes drifted from the nearly finished houses to the grassy bank of the dam. He wasn't a man of lawsuits or loud confrontations. He was a man of the land. And the land, he knew, had its own laws and its own methods of justice. A simple valve wheel, untouched for years, waited. It was not a weapon of vengeance, but an instrument of balance. And James Carter finally understood what he had to do. The proper way became a labyrinth of despair. James, a man who believed in the fundamental fairness of a hard day's work and a man's word, entered the legal system with faith. He filed formal complaints with the county, his handwriting precise and earnest on the forms. He showed his deed to clerks and junior officials, who would nod with vague sympathy before explaining their hands were tied. He even secured a court date, a moment that filled him with a fragile hope. But the HOA's legal team was a machine designed to crush such hope. They didn't argue the morality of the case. They buried it in procedure. They filed for continuances, claiming their lead counsel was unavailable. They submitted motions to dismiss based on arcane technicalities, forcing James to spend days in the library trying to understand the language. They demanded he produce documentation dating back a century, knowing full well that such papers might have been lost to time, flood, or simple misfortune. Each legal letter he received was another brick in a wall. Each court delay, another turn of the screw. His life savings, meager as they were, began to bleed away into filing fees and the cost of a reluctant, overmatched public attorney. Meanwhile, the new residents of Sweetbriar Meadows Phase 2 settled into the homes planted firmly on his legacy. Their lives unfolded in a cruel pantomime of normalcy. Shiny SUVs navigated the fresh asphalt streets where he'd once walked his property line. Sprinklers hissed over impeccably green lawns that had once been his wildflower meadow. The smell of their weekend barbecues carried on the wind, a scent that to them meant community, but to James was the smell of a feast on a grave. He became a specter in their paradise. When he walked, for he still walked, refusing to be banished from his own earth, they would watch him from behind curtains or over the hoods of their cars. Their gazes were not curious, but wary and annoyed. Some of the more brazen ones would approach him. "Can I help you?" a man washing his BMW would ask, his tone implying James was soliciting or lost. "This is private property, sir. You can't just be walking through here," another would say, jabbing a thumb toward a sign that read, HOA property, no trespassing. One evening, a woman deadheading her roses told him plainly, "You need to leave for good. You're making people uncomfortable." But the deepest cut came on a bright Saturday afternoon. He was walking along the edge of the new cul-de-sac, his head down, when he heard a small voice. A little girl, no older than 5, was pointing a sticky finger at him from her tricycle. "Mommy, who's that man?" Her mother, without looking up from her phone, gave a dismissive wave. "Oh, honey, he's nobody. Just ignore him." The words landed not like a knife, but like a shovel of dirt on a coffin. Nobody. He was the legacy of a freedman, the steward of the land, the memory of his ancestors. He was a father, a widower, a man who had loved and lost and worked until his hands were raw. And to this woman, in this place built on his stolen history, he was nobody. He had been fully erased. The fight drained out of him then, not into defeat, but into a cold, still, and absolute resolve. The courts were not a system of justice. They were a tool for those who could afford to play the game. His voice, his story, his deeds, they were just paper to be ignored or buried. But he had another voice. It was the voice that had sung his ancestors to sleep, that had given life to the crops, and that now churned, silent and powerful, behind the earth and concrete of the dam. If they would not hear his voice in a courtroom, they would hear it in a language they could not ignore, in the roar of water, a force that did not understand deeds or lawyers, but only pressure, flow, and the immutable pull of gravity. The time for talking was over. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of a storm. A low, throaty rumble of thunder echoed the growl of the earth movers that had, until recently, defiled James's land. He stood on the grassy bank of the dam, the wind plucking at his worn jacket. Below him, the new subdivision of Sweetbriar Meadows lay spread out like a toy town, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light that felt like a personal insult. Each light represented a family living in blissful ignorance on soil, soaked with his family's sweat and history. He could hear the faint, happy shrieks of children playing before the rain drove them inside. He could see a man in a bright yellow raincoat hurriedly covering a grill. Their lives were so small, so temporary. They worried about their patios getting wet. They had no concept of the deep, patient roots they had built their lives upon, roots they had severed with a lawyer's letter. He thought of his grandfather, Elijah, a man with a back as straight as an oak and hands gnarled from labor. He could almost see him, sitting right there on the bank with a simple pole, pulling catfish from the dark water, his laughter a low, rich sound that competed with the bullfrogs. This water had sustained them. It had baptized children and quenched the thirst of mules and men alike. His father's voice came to him then, not as a memory, but as if carried on the storm wind itself. A strong, unwavering tone that had guided him his whole life. "This land is your blood, James. It's your responsibility. You protect it. You never, ever let anyone take what's yours. Not without a fight." He had tried to fight their way. He had tried reason, paperwork, and pleading. They had answered with laughter and legal paperwork, reducing a century of legacy to a mere dispute. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, cold and decisive. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, freezing it for a split second. The manicured lawns, the pristine fences, the dam beneath his feet. In that stark, electric light, the choice was as clear and elemental as the water itself. He walked to the large, iron control wheel, its surface cold and rough with a lifetime of rust. He placed his hands on it, the same hands that had planted crops, held his wife, and cradled his son. They did not tremble. They were the steady hands of a man who had worked the land his whole life, who understood cause and effect, sowing and reaping. He leaned into it. With a groan that seemed to come from the very earth, the wheel began to turn. Slowly at first, fighting him every inch, then with a sudden, releasing shudder, it spun freely. Deep within the dam structure, massive gates ground open. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the rain. Then, a new sound emerged, a deep, throaty rumble that was not thunder. It was the sound of pent-up power being unleashed. A wall of water, once held in respectful check, surged forward with primordial force. It tore down the channels and streams that James knew like the lines on his own palm, but which the developers had arrogantly straightened and contained with concrete. The water remembered its old paths, and it began to reclaim them. It started in the lowest lying yards. A shallow sheet of water became a pond, then a lake. It poured into window wells, then began to lick at basement doors. The carefully laid sod, with its shallow roots, simply lifted and floated away. Panic erupted. Porch lights flicked on, doors flew open. The sounds of laughter were replaced by shouts of alarm, the slamming of doors, and the frantic revving of a car engine stalling in the rising flood. From his perch, James watched. He saw the HOA president's BMW, its nose submerged in his driveway. He saw the woman who had told him he was nobody frantically trying to stack sandbags that were instantly washed away. He heard the distant wail of sirens, answering the screams into 911. But James just stood silently, a solitary figure against the stormy sky. He did not smile in triumph. He felt no vengeance. He felt a profound, terrible justice. He watched as the water, a force older than deeds and lawyers, did what the courts would not. It was not destroying. It was reclaiming. It was washing away the arrogant stain of the present and revealing the timeless, powerful truth of the land beneath. The water was speaking his language, and for the first time in a long time, the land was finally answering. The floodwaters did not carry the houses away in a biblical deluge. Their destruction was subtler, more insidious, and far more costly. The force of the water sought out every weakness the hurried construction had left behind. It infiltrated, saturated, and undermined. Foundations, poured on what was essentially reclaimed wetland without proper permits, cracked like pottery. Basements became swimming pools, their walls buckling under the hydraulic pressure. Electrical systems shorted out in a symphony of sparks, leaving the entire development dark and dangerous. When the water receded, it left behind a swampy ruin and the sour smell of mud and regret. The county inspectors arrived, took one look at the cracked slabs and leaning porches, and immediately declared Sweetbriar Meadows Phase 2 unsafe and uninhabitable. The final, exquisite twist of the knife came from the insurance companies. Their investigators, poring over the suddenly relevant property records, discovered the festering title dispute. Policies were voided en masse. The fine print clearly excluded coverage for structures built on land not legally owned by the policyholder. Overnight, the HOA's smug confidence evaporated. Their lawyers, so adept at filing motions and draining an old man's savings, were powerless against the force of nature and the cold, hard facts it had exposed. The media descended, and the story of the quiet black man who had flooded his own stolen land became a national firestorm. News vans parked on the muddy streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. James, no longer a ghost, stood before cameras and investigators with a quiet dignity. He presented his deed and his decades of tax receipts, documents the HOA had successfully buried in court, but now shown with undeniable legitimacy under the glare of public scrutiny. The truth, once a whisper, was now a roar. He had always been the rightful owner. The court of public opinion was fiercely divided. Was James Carter a folk hero, a modern-day David using the land itself as a sling against a corporate Goliath? Or was he a vengeful villain who had destroyed the homes of innocent families? The debate raged on cable news and social media. But amidst the arguing, one undeniable fact anchored the entire saga. Without James's land, there would have never been a neighborhood to begin with. Their dream homes were built on a foundation of theft. The legal aftermath was swift and brutal. The courts, now unable to ignore the evidence, formally returned the full title of the land to James. The HOA, once a powerful entity, was now besieged by a tsunami of lawsuits from furious, bankrupted homeowners. Their assets were liquidated, and their board members were publicly disgraced. The shiny new houses, symbols of a stolen future, were left to the elements. Windows were boarded up, and condemned, notices were plastered on the doors. Weeds choked the gardens. They became rotting shells, eerie monuments to greed and arrogance, a permanent scar on the landscape, and a cautionary tale. James Carter paid no mind to the hollowed-out structures on the periphery of his property. He turned his back on them and got to work. With a methodical patience, he began to rebuild the land in his own way. He planted young saplings where ancient oaks had fallen. He carefully repaired the dam, not as a weapon, but as a steward. He walked the boundaries with his son and granddaughter, telling them the stories of every hill and stream, ensuring the legacy would continue. And whenever someone, a reporter or a curious stranger, asks him if he regrets opening the dam, if he lies awake at night thinking about the flooded homes, he just looks out over the healing land, a knowing glint in his eye, and offers a small, quiet smile. They thought I was powerless, he says, his voice as steady as the earth beneath his feet. But the land knows who it belongs to. It just needed a little help remembering.